In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a full-stack web application using Spring Boot and Vaadin. The application that we're going to build is the classic to-do application, so we can see our to-dos, we're able to add new to-dos and edit the to-dos, we're able to delete completed to-dos, and pretty much everything that you would expect. We save all of this to a database so that the changes are persisted. The first step in creating the project is to use Spring Initializer. Here on the Spring Initializer webpage, we can define some of the dependencies that we want included. In our case, we want web, we want Vaadin, we want JPA, and also for a database, we're going to use H2. Here we can give our artifact, Maven artifact, a name. In this case, we could just name it to-do and click Generate Project. This will create a zip file containing the actual project that we have, and we can then go ahead and open up this project in our IDE of choice. And if we go in here and look at the project that we just created, we can see that there is not a whole lot going on here. We have one single Java file containing a main method that just starts the Spring application. So the first thing we need to do in order to get started is create a new file, and this file will be called ToDo UI. The UI class is the main entry point into a Vaadin application. In order for this to get picked up by Vaadin, we need to annotate this with a Spring UI annotation, and also we're going to give it a theme annotation specifying which Vaadin theme we want to use. The ToDo UI class will extend UI from the Vaadin package and comes with one single method called init. The init method will get called once during the lifecycle of the application when the user comes in. Here in the init method, we can then start kind of building the actual UI of our application. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of split this into a couple of methods to keep everything really nice and clear, and hopefully you'll be able to follow along. So I'm going to create a few methods, and then I'm going to implement them. So we're going to create a method for setting up the layout, one for adding the header, one for adding the form where we can edit new to-dos. We'll have one for the to-do list, and one for the action button. And then use the IDE to actually implement these methods. Okay, so with those in place, we can go ahead and start implementing these. For the main layout, we're going to use something called vertical layout, which just stacks all the components we put into it vertically on top of each other. I'm going to store this in a field called layout, and then we're going to set the content of our UI to this layout. That way, anything we put into this layout will get shown. For the header, the only thing we're going to add there is a label, and the label will have the text to do. And we're going to add this to the layout. For the form, we need to do a little bit more, since if you remember, the input field and the button are next to each other. That means that we need to nest those into a horizontal layout that we put into the main layout. That way we can control the overall layout. So we're going to create a new horizontal layout. We can call this form layout, and then we're going to create two components, one text field. We're going to call this task field. That's for the inputting the task, and then we're going to create a button, and the button we'll just call it add, and factor this into a variable. Then what we do is just add those both to the form layout. Add components, task field, add button, and finally we're going to add this form layout to our main layout. All right. Then for the to-do list, what I'm actually going to do is use Spring here to auto-wire the to-do layout. So we're going to create a new class called to-do layout, or sorry, to-do list. And obviously this isn't created yet, so we can use our ID to create this class. This will also extend a vertical layout. And in here we can then list the actual to-do items that we have. For now we're just going to annotate this with a component annotation to make Spring aware of it, but we're not going to go in and implement this yet. So the only thing we need to do here is just add the to-do list to the main layout. And finally, we're going to create a new button for deleting the completed items. We can call this delete button and add this to the layout. All right. So what I'm going to do right now is enable JRebel for this project. It's not something that you need to do, but if you do happen to have a JRebel license handy, this is a very nice way of speeding up the development by hot swapping changes. If you don't have JRebel, don't worry about it. You can just follow along with the steps without having it. That just means that you need to restart the server every time you want to see the code changes. So with that in place, we're going to go into our run configurations. We will create a new configuration, and it will be a, where's that, Maven configuration. We call this run, and we're just going to pass the Maven targets here to it. So we're going to do a clean, we're going to do a package, and we're going to do a Spring Boot run. So that's all there is to it. Spring Boot will automatically take care of starting up the application, configuring everything, and starting up a server to run it with. You can press apply here, and then we're going to start this with JRebel. Take a little while here. And while that's starting up, we can go into our browser here, and once that starts up, you can see that we have the UI components. Now obviously this doesn't look anywhere near what we wanted it to look like, but we're going to get there. So let's start off by just kind of making our screen a little bit nicer here and give us some more space here. So the first thing we want to do here is just fix the layout. So the first thing is to make sure that we center everything in our layout. So we can just go in and set the default component alignment to middle center. That will make sure that any component that we add to this layout will get added in the middle. For the header, what we want to do is just give it a style name. And there's a helper class in the Valo theme that we used where we have predefined constants for all the style names that we have available to us, so we don't need to remember them by heart. And we're going to call set size undefined, which basically makes the label center. The next part here is to make sure that the horizontal layout has some spacing, makes it look a little bit nicer. So by calling set spacing true, we essentially add a little bit of space between each component, which makes it look a whole lot nicer. The other thing I want to do here is call set width with 80%. So this way the horizontal layout will be 80% wide. For the to-do list, we want to do the same thing. So just set width 80%, and the action button is fine. So let's run this and see where we are. There's still a couple of things we need to fix, but let's take this in small steps. Okay, so we have everything centered. We can see that the label got larger, but the form doesn't look quite the way we wanted it to look. Let's fix that. So the first thing we want to do is make the task field wider. Make it actually 100% wide, and this is 100% wide of the layout slot that it's in. This goes into Vaadin layouting a little bit. I'll add a link to the proper documentation for that. I'm not going to go through it right now. And the other part then is to go into the form layout here and setting an expand ratio to that task field of 1. So this works more or less the same way as the CSS Flexbox if you're interested. Also, the add button in our spec didn't have the text add, rather it had an icon. So we can just call set icon, and we can use some built-in icons. We have, for instance, font awesome icons, and we're going to use the plus icon there. We're also going to mark the button as the primary button. This is just a style thing, but it makes it a little bit more obvious to the user which button that they should be clicking on. So we can just, again, add stylement aim and then use the theme helper here and give it a style name of button primary. So let's save that and refresh this. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so the next part of building the application will be to actually build the data model. We need some sort of database, we need something to put into the database, and then we need a repository so that we can actually pull the stuff out of the database. So let's go into our source folder here, make this a little bit wider, and we're going to create a new class here. I'm actually going to create a ToDo class like this. In order to save some time, I've already pre-done this, but it's basically just a JPA class mapped with an entity. It has a long ID that's auto-generated. It has two fields, one for the actual text and one for the done state, and then there's a toggle method that toggles between done and undone. So with the ToDo entity in place, the next thing we need to do is create a repository. We can call this ToDo repository. And this is going to be an interface extending JPA repository of type ToDo with a key of long. And this is one of the nice things with Spring Boot, meaning that we don't need to actually implement this interface. Just the fact that we're running within Spring Boot will make sure that Spring Boot will both configure the database and make sure that we have a basic CRUD repository for our ToDo objects just by including this interface. Finally, I'm going to add a little helper file here so that we have some test data to play around with. Just call this data.sql. So a file named data.sql that's within the resources folder here will get picked up by Spring Boot and run when the application starts up. So that means that we'll have some data that we can play around with when we start up. So let's restart the server. Obviously, since this only runs once when Spring Boot starts up, we need to restart the server. While it's starting up, we can go into this to-do list component that we created that's still completely empty. And in here, since this is a Spring managed component, we are able to use auto-wired, and we can auto-wire that repository that we just created. Let's call this repository. The other thing we want to do here is just have a init method, and we're going to mark this with a Postconstruct annotation. So since we're in a container managed bean here, or a container managed component, we can't use the constructor method because by the time that runs, all of these auto-wired things aren't necessarily populated yet. So in order to get around that, we're going to use this Postconstruct method instead of a constructor. the first thing we want to do here is basically just set the spacing again to true. The next thing we want to do is actually go to the repository and find all the to-dos that we have, and then we want to call a method called setToDos that we're going to create. SetToDos basically takes the list of to-dos and adds them to this list. First thing I'm going to do here is call remove all components. So I want to remove all the previous components if there are any every time I add new to-dos. Otherwise I'm just going to keep adding to that list of components. So once I've removed everything that was in here before, I can go ahead and just go through each of the to-dos, and for each of them I'm just going to call add component with a new to-do layout that takes in that particular to-do. So then we need to go in and actually create this new class, and in this case we're not going to extend vertical layout, rather we're going to extend horizontal layout. So you can see a pattern emerging here. In Vaadin, when we create components, what we want to usually like to do is just create these compositions of the lower level components that are in the framework to build these more specific components that are applicable to our problem that we're trying to solve. So in the to-do layout, there are two things that we need. One is a new checkbox. So we have the checkbox that shows whether or not the to-do is done. Say this to a field called done. Then we're going to have a new text field called text. And here note the naming of these fields. So we have fields here called done and text, and they exactly match the names in our to-do object here. We're going to use that a little bit later on to actually bind the data that we have. So again, we want to use the set spacing here to make it look a little bit nicer. We're also going to set the default alignment to middle left. That way they're vertically centered and look a little bit nicer. And finally we're going to add the components to the layout. So we're going to add the text field, or sorry, the checkbox and the text field to the layout. Okay, so let's take a look at how this looks. We're going to run this, go back to our browser, and we can see that we have three sets of the to-do layouts. Obviously they don't have any data yet, and they don't really look the way we want them to. There's another thing that I don't like. You can see that the fields here are touching each other, and that's because I forgot to add spacing to the main layout here, so we can just go in and set spacing to true here. I'm going to set the spacing there. So the next thing we want to do is obviously get the data from the to-do objects into the fields here. So for that we're going to use something called a field group. A field group basically in Vaadin just tells the framework which fields belong together, which fields should be bound to the same data. And the field group here will take in a bean item, which is basically just a helper that takes in the to-do object. With that in place, we can call field group .bind member fields this, which will then go and actually match these field names with the field names in this to-do object. The other thing I want to do here is add some styling. So I'm going to add a style name to the text field, again using the built-in helpers here. And I want to get rid of the border here, so I'm going to add the text field borderless style name here. I'm also going to set the width to 100%, and again set the expand ratio for the text field to 1, basically giving it all the extra space available in this layout. Let's take a look at this. All right, so we can see that now we actually have the text here. The text fields don't have the border anymore, and we can see the status of these. Okay, so now we basically have the functionality in place for displaying to-dos. The next thing we want to do is add functionality for actually adding these to-dos. So we're going to go back into our UI class here, into the form here, and what I want to do first is just add some logic to the add button. So we're going to add a click listener to this, and here we can define what happens when the user clicks on the button. And what we want to do is obviously create a new to-do with the value from the task field. And what we're going to do with this is actually pass this to the to-do list. So we're going to just call to-do list.add. Obviously this method isn't implemented yet, but we can use the ID to do that. So we have the unimplemented to-do here, add method here, and what we're going to do in here is simply call repository.save and pass in that to-do. And once we've added that, we want to go in and refresh the to-dos that we have. So we're going to call update. We don't have this implemented yet, but you can, if you remember, we have this method where we actually call set to-dos on all. So we can use our ID again to refactor this into its own method so that we don't need to duplicate code. So going back to our to-do UI here, we've added a new to-do to the list. The next thing we want to do is clear the task field. That way we're able to enter the next task. And just to kind of make the user experience nicer, we can go ahead and help the user by focusing the field for them. That way they don't need to click back into it. Obviously, for that to be helpful, we want to go ahead and focus the field in the first place. Another very nice thing from a user experience standpoint is to make the user able to click, or instead of click, use their enter button. So we can do that very simply by setting a click shortcut to keycode.enter. So with these two things in place, we should be able to add new things. Let's go ahead and restart this. And try this. You can see that we got a new to-do here, and if we refresh the browser, we can see that it's still here, so it's been persisted to the database. Very nice. Obviously there's still one thing missing, namely if we change the status of any of these and refresh, we get back to the state that we were in. So we're not persisting any of the changes. You do remember that we have this data binding here. The thing that it doesn't do yet is write this changed data back to the database. So there are two things that we need to do in order to accomplish that. The first thing is I'm going to set the buffering to false on this field group. Basically this means that any changes we make here will get immediately propagated to this to-do object. The other thing that I want to do is introduce a new interface here, and I'm going to call this a to-do ChangeListener. So if you've paid attention, you've noticed that in Vaadin most of the things, actions that we create are based on listeners, so the kind of classic observer pattern. And that's something that I want to mimic here in my own application. So I'm just going to have a interface with a single method called toDoChanged, and this method will take in the to-do that was changed. So when we have that, we can go back into the to-do list here and implement that method, or implement the interface, I should say. Always need to implement the method here. And what we want to do when the to-do was changed is actually the exact same as in add. So we want to save it and we want to update everything. So we can go ahead and call add with that to do. Obviously this name doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, so we can probably change this to save just to keep things consistent. So now we have a way of actually saving the change. What we don't have is a way to actually trigger that listener. So let's pass in this listener interface to that to-do layout. So we can go ahead and add that there. Of course, we don't want to depend on the actual layout that implements this interface. We want to depend on the interface. That way we can reuse this component throughout our project. I'll call this ChangeListener. So the final thing to do here is actually have this listener triggered whenever we change something in our field. So call arrays.list done text. So we're going to just loop through the fields, and for each field what I'm going to do is just add a value change listener. So very much the same thing that we created our own, but here we're going to use the built-in Vaadin value change listener. And on each change, we will then call ChangeListener.changed with the to-do. Okay. So let's restart this and check it out. Restart the application here. Change the status here. Go and refresh. And you can see that the changes persist. We can add a new one, refresh, and everything is here. The final piece of functionality that we need to add is this delete completed button. So we can go back into our to-do UI class here. And here where we create the delete button, again, we want to add a listener for the click event. Add a click listener. And what we want to do on that click event is call to-do list dot delete completed. We go ahead and implement the method. And what we need to do in this method is basically go through all the to-dos that we have, figure out which ones are completed, and then delete those from the database and update. So let's do that. The first thing is that we need to have the to-dos available to us. We can expose the to-dos we have into a field. That way always the latest to-dos that we have will be available to us. And we can, after that, we can use the Java 8 Collections API to filter these. Basically to-do that is done, so we want to just have the ones that are done. We're going to collect those into a to list, so we just want to have a list of those. And what we want to do with those is just pass them to repository.delete in batch. That way we can have a batch operation that deletes all of those in one go. And finally, we want to call the update method so that we can refresh the to-dos and delete the ones that aren't there anymore. Let's restart this and check out the result. And there we have it. So that's a very quick introduction to both Spring Boot and Vaadin. The kind of takeaway from here is that you can build full stack web applications very easily with Vaadin and Spring Boot. I'll post some links in the show notes just to kind of help you get started. And if you have any questions, please post them in YouTube and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Thanks.